Hi, welcome to How to Repair. This video is on how to fit washing machine bearings into the drum. We will show you how to fit the bearings using a homemade fitting tool which will cost you less than £3 or £4. And this saves hitting the bearings with a hammer and damaging it. You can see all the parts that we're fitting here. The main seal, the small bearing which is at the back, the larger bearing which is inside the drum, and then you have the tub seal. We're working on a Bosch, but this is good for Bosch, Balay, Neff and Siemens. Now you can see the bearing tool that I'm talking about. It's just a threaded bolt with the two bearings sit on and a couple of washers just slightly smaller than the outer race on the bearing. And as you do the nut up, it pulls the bearings tight into the drum. More about that later in the video. First we need to strip the machine down, so most of the outer panels, lid, back panel, front facial panel and door panel will all need to come off. Slipping the belt off here. Soap drawer. Door interlock will need to be undone. Door seal will need to be removed. Good idea to tuck it inside so you don't do any damage to it. Take off the facial panel. This has got a few clips on the top as well as the screws. The kick strip completely removed. There's two screws at the bottom here. Once you've removed them, the panel will come free. You must remember, with all different models of machine, there are different variations to the techniques. We've got 3 screws around the concrete block, and it's a good idea to take a photograph of any wiring that you remove so you can get it correct when reassembling. We're going to take the heater out, door lock off, save any damage to it. There might be a couple of cable ties you need to remove. The outer band that holds the block in place. Once you've removed the 3 screws, then the concrete block can be removed. The reason why we're removing all these blocks is, 1, it's a lot easier to work on when you take it out of the machine because it's a lot lighter, and 2, you don't do any damage to the block, of course. Now removing the door seal completely. Few screws at the top for the facial panel holder, and we'll need to remove the hose off the bottom of the soap drawer. Now we're going to remove the top concrete block. This box slides back slightly before you lift it. I'm undoing the soap drawer hoses completely to remove the whole soap drawer. Good idea to clean it as well, as that's where the bacteria builds. Now we're removing the suspension legs, the hose, the heater, the motor and all the additional wiring. While I'm doing this, remember, on the website you'll get full instructions on the bearing tool as well as instructions for how to do the job. Now this is the pressure bowl chamber. It has a funny clip on the back of it which you can't see, but you need to press it in to remove it. Now the heating element nut you need to undo until it comes to the top of the thread, then hit it in, and this will allow the element to slide out. The wiring for the motor has a special clip on the plug that you need to press to remove it. On this model of the machine there is only 2 bolts holding the motor in place. Both of them need to be removed. Then with a screwdriver slightly prise the motor off the lugs, remembering the motor is very heavy, so be careful when removing it. Next we need to undo the suspension legs on either side. Just remove the bolts and then the leg comes free. Do the same on the other side. Now on this model of machine there is a steel bar that runs across the top which supports the springs. On other models the springs are held in place on the panel themselves. I'm also removing the pressure switch so nothing gets in the way of the drum when removing. Now here's the bar with the springs on, just unattaching them from the drum. And now we have the soap drawer hose, removing that. We have the two suspension legs, which can only be removed by a special tool, but they can be removed when the drum is split. Now you'll see the screws on this one. With the new bearing kit you get some additional screws to go in the holes that do not have screws at the moment. That's because we're going to be breaking off some manufacturing lugs, but this is standard practice for replacing Bosch bearings or on any of the other models I mentioned earlier. So undo all the screws. Now these are the plastic lugs that we need to break off. Now there are many ways of doing it. You could use a Dremel and cutting them carefully. I prefer to use a sharp chisel and go very slowly because you do not want to make a hole in the drum. So just cut them at the top, just so you cut them through, and then you can put the chisel underneath and just flick them up and they should break. But do take your time. There's about 27 of them that you have to break off. I'm not going to video them all, but just undoing the last one here. Just see me cutting it carefully with a chisel. Good idea to have someone helping me with this job. I've been doing it for many years, so I'm quite able to do it on my own, but if you're doing it at home, best to have someone holding the drum so you don't cut yourself or do any damage to the drum. Once the drum, all the clips are off, you need to split the drum. Just go round carefully, don't do any damage to the drum. It's usually quite hard to separate it where the suspension legs are, but just slowly going round prising it and you'll be able to split it. And there we go on that. Now here you can see all the lugs that I've snapped off. You could, if you wanted to, remove them flush down to the cabinet, but it's not necessary. Next thing we need to do is take off the pulley. Now, a little technique: if you put a screwdriver, hammer, handle in, you can lock the wheel to save it turning while undoing the bolt. And on most machines you need to give it a slight tap on the shaft. Always use a piece of wood between it so you don't do any damage to the shaft end. This is how the new seal fits on. The edge the seal sits on is a Bosch. Some are stainless, some are brass or bronze. And the seal itself fits in the back half of the drum. Now I'm making two pieces of wood here to fit in between the lugs that we snapped off so we don't do any damage to the drum. First we're going to knock out the back bearing, and then we're going to knock out the front bearing and the seal. Now, I'm using a round end chisel which is specially designed for knocking bearings. There's the seal coming off at the same time, which we're going to replace on the tub. Just tap it slowly, making sure you don't do any damage to the outer casing where the bearing sits. That's the back bearing, that's the smaller bearing. This is the tub seal I'm removing here. Again, making sure it sits nicely on your pieces of wood so you don't do any damage to your floor or the drum, vinyl floor. And then just taking your time, going round opposite sides, just tap it lightly and the bearing will come out with the seal. Now at this point it's a good idea to take all three components, front half of the drum, back half of the drum and the drum itself, outside, give it a good clean. Pressure washer would be best, but if you've only got a hose pipe, just get a scrubbing brush in there, clean everything up. I've already pressure washed this tub and I'm just cleaning out the bearing casing, removing any oil or bits. Make sure it's absolutely spotless, and we're ready to install the new bearings. Again, making sure that your drum sits nicely on the wood. Now all you need to do is just slightly tap the outer race of the bearing just so it sits in there. You don't need to hammer it in. Next, you need to do the same on the inner bearing, which is the larger bearing, and then the seal will follow after we've installed the bearings. Now, the tool that I've made can be purchased from any hardware store for about between £3 and £5. It's a bar with thread on, which is about 25 centimeters long, about 12 millimeters wide, threaded all the way. You need to purchase a couple of nuts to go on the bar, and about 2 or 3 washers, about a millimeter and a half thick. Thicker the better, really. These washers are basically just slightly smaller than the outer race of the bearing. Now, as you can see, once I've assembled it all you will need to do is do it up, and you will get to the point where you cannot turn it anymore. Now, it can be quite hard, so it might take 2 of you to do it up, one holding the front and one holding the back, but literally get it to the point where it will not turn anymore. Once that is achieved, your bearings should be fully in place in the drum. That means that the inner bearing will go all the way through to the race edge, and the outer bearing at the back will basically be flush with the tub. This now is ready for the inner seal to be fitted. Now, when fitting the seal, just use the back end of the hammer, if it's a mallet like I've got, and just tap it softly round the edge, and you could use the old bearing if it's still intact to tap it in place. Now, this needs to go flush with the plastic on the drum, so you might need, just at the end, just to tap it slightly. You could also, to help it slide in, possibly put a little bit of fairy liquid on it. That's one technique I use occasionally. Then clean it all off, and as I said earlier, this is the shaft that sits onto the bearings. Here's the bush. Make sure it's thoroughly clean. Very, very fine wet and dry paper if you need to clean it up a lot. Then it drops down, and you might need to tap it. Now, if you need to tap it, use your piece of wood again until the shaft comes through the drum to the point where you know the pulley wheel will fit on nicely. And then the bolt on the pulley wheel will take up any surplus that needs to be pulled in. Again, using the back end of a hammer or chisel or whatever you have, piece of wood, to lock the pulley wheel between the aluminium and the drum. Then do the nut up tight, and then give it 1/4 of a turn. And I usually just give it an extra tap with a hammer, just a little bit, just to make sure it's locked in place. Now we're ready to refit the front half of the tub to the back half. Everything turning nicely there. Again, put down your wood just to protect the wheel. Now, what we need to do is put a silicone bead in before we fit the gasket or the tub seal. Here's the tub seal, and also the extra bolts I mentioned earlier, which I'll show you in a minute. Now, the seal has a join in it, which is usually just, believe it or not, super glued. And what needs to be done is that needs to be fitted at the top half of the drum, so if it ever does break, the chance of water coming out is very slim. Then take your time, put a reasonable silicone bead in to hold the seal in place. If you put too much, there will be some surplus that comes out, but I always say it's a little bit Better to have more than less, because at least you won't have any leaks, but it might make a mess that you need to clean up. Now remember, silicon is a substance that gives off fumes, and it's quite irritating to the eyes and smell. But just take your time, get it all in place, and before the silicon goes off, get the front half of the drum nicely squeezed down by hand. Then holding the inner drum, rotate the whole drum over, and we're ready to put the screws or bolts in. Now, when doing these screws up, it's a good idea to work opposites. So, in other words, if you start at 6 o'clock, then go to 12 o'clock, then go to 9 o'clock, then to 3 o'clock, and continue around the drum to pull the drum evenly onto the gasket. As long as you work in a time scale to get it all fitted before the silicon starts setting, you'll be fine. You normally have about half hour in a reasonable climate. Of course, hotter the climate, the quicker the silicon will go off. Now remember, at the website you will get full tutorials on the whole procedure for this, and you will also get tutorials on every repair needed on Bosch, Neff, Siemens and Balay, and of course other manufacturers. Now what I'm doing here is I'm actually filling the drum up with water to the point where it comes out of the waste hole at the bottom. This way I'm able to go round the whole drum and inspect for any leaks before assembling the machine, because there's nothing worse than spending all this time assembling it and then finding out you've got a leak and you've got to take it all apart again. So once the silicon's gone off, just fill it with water, give it half an hour and you'll spot any leaks straight away. Now we're assembling the spring system for the top, and we'll just lift the drum. Now I've already fitted the motor and heating element to this because I'm a reasonable sized person and the weight doesn't make much difference to me. But of course, if you're not very strong, it's a good idea to fit the motor separately after. Again, we're just going to slowly go through fitting all the parts that we took off, suspension legs, all the brackets. Connecting the sump hose with that awkward plastic clip, which will just push into place. Then remembering to check your camera or mobile phone, making sure you get all the wiring correct. Connecting the motor plug, remembering to connect the earth as well. And then make sure you keep all the wiring neat and tidy and replace any cable ties, and you can actually add additional cable ties if you think the loom is loose. Connecting the pressure switch, refitting the door seal. Now really the only difficult part of this whole reassembly is the concrete block at the front. Once we've finished fitting the door seal and getting the band on, we will put the concrete block on, which sits inside the plastic clips that you can see here. Then the metal band goes around the outside of the plastic clips, and you do it up about halfway. Insert the 3 screws, do these up 3/4 of the way. Then we tighten the band, and the very last thing is to do the screws up completely. And what this actually does is it keeps the concrete block nice and central on the clips and no damage can occur. Right, next, as you can see, just put in one of the facial panel bars on. Now we'll fit the soap drawer. Attaching the hose at the bottom, making sure you get the clip on. then the top facial panel bar, followed by the two clips that hold the concrete block in place. Now when you drop the concrete block onto the bar, or the bolts, it slides forward. Then you do the bolts up. Again, nice even tension. I would suggest doing it hand tight and then quarter of a turn again. Now we'll connect the door lock. The front facial panel just slides onto the lugs and then pushes upwards. Reinsert the door lock, fitting the two screws. Kick strip at the bottom, which has one screw. While I'm doing this, please remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, as that's what keeps us going and able to make these free videos for you. Now we'll just fit the door seal. Again, all these individual repairs in detail can be found at the website, and of course the cheapest places to buy the parts that we can find for you. Just fitting the facial panel. Remember, there's a few clips at the top of the panel, so just carefully push the panel in place so it all clips. Replace the screws, remembering that they're stainless screws in this area. Then insert the soap drawer. We'll fit the washing machine belt. This could be fitted when we fitted the motor, but I didn't bother. Remember, when fitting the belt, make sure it sits nice and square on the top pulley wheel. You can check this by looking down from the top, and just to adjust it, you just move the belt up and down on the splines on the motor. The lid, the back panel. And now we'll have a quick listen to the machine, much quieter. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to subscribe to our channel and please visit the website. Thanks very much for watching.